We're going to start our next session on opacity and illicit flows. My name is Victoria Baranetsky. I'm the General Counsel at the Center for Investigative Reporting. I'll go through and introduce the rest of our panelists here today. Dan Nielson, who's from the University of Texas at Austin. Gary Kalman, Transparency International, US. Brooke Harrington from Dartmouth College. And Mark Weidemaier from the University of North Carolina School of Law. So I was asked to just give a few phrasing, a few questions at the beginning and phrase why we're here today. And one of the reasons why I'm here on this panel is because I'm a media attorney for journalists at the Center for Investigative Reporting. And as a media attorney, one of the things I trade in is trying to get access for reporters. And we do that through the very small means that we have possible in the United States. That's really limited to the First Amendment law and trying to unseal cases and FOIA. And in general, in the United States, while many think that transparency is one of the founding tenets, in a democracy, it's actually not something that's protected really under United States laws or constitutions very widely. Transparency is not considered a right under the First Amendment itself. And this is at a time, where we are talking about this at a time when we need information the most. So I was actually approached a few years ago. I thought I'd tell one short story about a reporter named Aaron Glantz, who's here at Stanford, and he asked me, Vicki, I'd like to tell a story about the landlords in the United States, because now 40% of rent-owned buildings are not publicly viewable who owns them. We can't tell who owns 40% of rental units in the United States. This is something that the Treasury has actually reported on. And I said, Aaron, that's impossible. I'm an attorney. I know if you have property records, you can go down and look through them and find out who owns the building. And he said, no, Vicki, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. And I said, I don't think that's true, but okay. So he ended up showing me that, in fact, most of these buildings are registered under LLCs. We filed a lawsuit against FinCEN to get the names of beneficial owners. FinCEN told us, sorry, the Bank Secrecy Act controls here. Good luck. Have fun another day. And so after that, in the state of California, someone proposed, in fact, a statute to have beneficial ownership records released. But I then found out that, in fact, we are one of the very few countries in the world that do not have beneficial ownerships released. And so then we signed on to a letter to Congress to have that information released further. And while you guys know, I think, probably the rest of the story, while that's now been passed in law, that FinCEN gets that information, certainly not public to most of the individuals who might want to know that. And so, for example, even here close to Silicon Valley, just last year there was a story about a US Air Force base named Travis Air Force Base. And people started seeing that the property around Travis Air Force was being bought up. On all three sides of Travis Airport, the property was being bought up and nobody understood who was buying this property. And they found out that it was something called Flannery Associates. There was actually a bunch of Silicon Valley, major wealth individuals who were buying up this property for their own reasons to build a future city one day. But this is just one tiny example of the very place we're in here today, of what we're talking about, and it obviously relates on a much more global scale. And so some of the questions that we're going to talk about here today is, how do you fight hidden institutions, people, and assets? How are you supposed to even find out and talk about those things when they're completely hidden, let alone in a global context? And more importantly, what is actually efficacious, right? Is it the criminal system? Is it, something with regards to the press? We're going to talk about the Panama Papers and the Pentagon Papers. What is the role of different institutions and how we go forward? So I'm very excited to pass it on to the rest of my colleagues here and have them please take us forward. And we will return for questions at the end. So Dan, please.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you about some research that I have been doing with two collaborators, Mike Findley, who's my colleague at UT Austin, and Jason Sharman at Cambridge University. And I think if we could bring my slides up. So, this is going to be a very social science-y presentation because I'm a social scientist, and kind of preview of coming attractions. Apologies for death by PowerPoint, but at least you have pictures. Brought to you by oligarchs who I am in no way implying have anything to do with money laundering or anonymous shell companies or anonymous banking. We've been doing field experiments in this space, and Alex referenced this earlier. And these are audit studies. So we learn in spaces where you cannot get data or it's difficult to get data, sometimes it's really good to generate the data with a systematic study. And that's what we've tried to do here. So we're really interested in learning through this audit, this global audit of companies, banks, and incorporation services around the world, just how easy it is to get access to the financial system, even if you represent a high-risk customer. And if the risks go up, the risk of criminal activity goes up, does that change the access that potential customer has to the financial system? And we do this through email, which the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers have revealed is the main way that most of this correspondence takes place. And we patterned the emails that we sent on that correspondence that's been leaked. So because it's in a field experiment, we can learn about the causal effects of the higher risk jurisdictions, the higher risk profiles of the customers on the access those customers have to the financial system through company formation and through anonymous banking. We did this study primarily in 2019 and 2020. But then after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we went back and did it again to learn if there were any meaningful differences. So the key question that motivated us is, does the Financial Action Task Force's system of global monitoring and global sanctions, does it actually work, right? The idea is that if risk goes up, customer risk goes up, they should employ the risk-based approach and screen those potential criminals from the financial system. So, do these KYC standards, know your customer standards work? Do smart sanctions, which have been patterned on the FATF standards, do they work? So smart sanctions are on individuals, and they're enforced like all of this whole regime is by private companies. So governments have sort of outsourced or offloaded the responsibility for enforcement onto private companies, which of course have mixed motivation, right? So incompatible incentives, since they're trying to pursue profits at the same time. So of course, if these companies don't enforce these standards, don't screen out criminals, then they're enabling tax evaders and kleptocrats and sanctions busters and of course money laundering generally. And so that's the motivation behind the study. So first step, clear this through the Institutional Review Board. It turns out that companies, despite some rulings of the Supreme Court in the United States, are not people. They're legal persons, but not human subjects in the sense that the IRB cares about. So the designation usually is this is not human subject research. That doesn't mean that they just give us a free pass, but the idea is we're studying up. When you're studying powerful organizations and institutions, they probably shouldn't get the same protections that vulnerable subjects have, vulnerable human subjects have. And so that's the idea. So want to know if banks will give us a bank account and if companies, corporate service providers will give us a shell company. And we're really interested in knowing if that can be anonymous. So the standard is they're supposed to demand photo ID of the beneficial owner in both cases. So we did this. We made about 40,000 email approaches around the world. The response rate was about 1/4, 25%, which is odd because even if we raised the amount of money that our company had, that we said we had, based on our research accounts, all of the approaches to banks use no active deception. So because lying to banks is fraud in the United States, where this research was taking place. So there were no lies told in these emails to banks, which meant that we had to actually form shell companies around the world. So at one time I was the proud owner of 12 shell companies around the world in 9 different countries. And then our research assistants that were working for us were representatives of these companies, since the research project owned the companies, or at least I was the beneficial owner, and the research project did the company. So all the banks contained no active deception. Of course, it was deceptive purpose in the sense that they didn't know that we were social scientists. They could find out if they wanted, but in those 15,000 emails to banks, only one figured out that this was a research study, which is shocking. So at least that they told us about. Maybe others, just didn't tell us. But with the intermediaries, the corporate service providers in the United States and in most jurisdictions that we know about, there's no law like the Bank Secrecy Act that that makes this fraud. So we did use deception in that case, mostly by using the names of people on sanctions lists. So I'll show you about that in a moment. So we randomly varied the identities of these senders. The main way we signaled risk was the jurisdiction in which their company resided. And the question is, does that higher risk reduce access? And then, of course, does that access change after the Russian invasion? So we got a bunch of correspondence back, and we coded all of it, human coders with high intercoder reliability, according to 4 different possible outcomes. Did they respond at all? And again, about 3/4 did not, which is a little surprising since we were customers that had up to $30 million of revenues. But that didn't really seem to matter. If you want to learn about that, we can talk about it in Q&A. Were they compliant with international standards by demanding photo ID of the beneficial owner? Did they refuse service altogether, which many did? Were they non-compliant? They didn't ask for photo ID of the beneficial owner. So that could be either because they didn't ask for photo ID, or they didn't ask for anything about the beneficial owner, right? So if they asked for ID for a director or for a nominee, that didn't count. It has to be the beneficial owner, the person really in charge of the company. So again, we had 5,000 banks, every bank that had a SWIFT code in the world, and then a sample of their branches, because we had all of those banks on the SWIFT list. We could do a representative random sample. That was not the case for corporate service providers. These were mostly standalone incorporation services or law firms that specialized in business law, so in corporate law. So those we just generated with internet searches, systematic searches in every country in the world, or using the every jurisdiction name in the world. And it was over 200 countries. We tried to make this as systematic as possible. Here were the conditions. You need to be able to compare it to something. So our placebo condition were companies that were formed in New Zealand or Australia. Sometimes we also used our UK companies as a placebo. They weren't very different from Australia and New Zealand. That was for the banks, for asking for bank accounts, either from banks directly or from those intermediaries indirectly. We didn't, no active deception. And and for the company formation requests, our placebo jurisdictions were, what we called in Australia, these 8 countries. Thanks to Gary and his team, we were able to, generate these lists based on Transparency International's Transparency Perception Index. So, and that was a large share, of what categorized the countries for us. So, we had the placebos, and then we had treatments based on the jurisdiction of the countries, major financial powers, offshore jurisdictions in BVI and the Seychelles, those associated with corruption, that had very, high corruption scores, low transparency scores on TI's index, and then finally one that according to terrorism risk ratings was high association with terrorism. So that was Pakistan. And then we did use active deception for the corporate service providers, and in those cases, we actually took the names of some individuals that were listed on Magnitsky sanctions laws that had been associated with the incarceration and murder of Sergei Magnitsky. These Magnitsky laws exist in more than 30 countries now, although not always enforced, right? And it doesn't really matter how we actually consider Magnitsky or not. The results that I'm going to show you were very consistent. We did change the middle initial for legal reasons, right? Also, because that's one of the first things people do when they want to obscure their identity. So here's what we learned. Just qualitatively, this was one of the actual responses we got from a company that worked in both the United States and the Seychelles. Because your clients are Russian citizen and the banks do not accept Russian clients, we suggest to use full nominee service to set up the company and open the bank account. We can provide you with a beneficial owner. That's supposed to be so illegal, right? We have set, and then they use power of attorney, right, in interesting ways to make sure that you can take control of the company whenever you want it, right? We have set up our shelf companies. Shelf companies are actually existing companies already, so they're not new companies. They've been around for a while. They have tax histories. We set up our shelf companies with a nominee director and nominee shareholder, supposed to be completely illegal according to the FATF, and set up each bank account with nominee signatory. So the bank won't see you as the beneficiary owner of the account. So you'll be full anonym, right? That was the answer. This was not the only one like this. This is just the one we liked the most. And so that tickled us and nauseated us at the same time. So here are the results. This is a coefficient plot. The dots are point estimates, and the lines are 95% confidence intervals. If those lines don't cross that 0 line where the placebo is set, it means it's statistically significant. But you can kind of see sort of what happened with each of these jurisdiction treatments on the likelihood they would respond, and if they responded, if they would be compliant, would refuse service or be non-compliant. And you can see here that the effects are significant for non-response across all of those jurisdictions, the treatments, but not very substantively large. Those are in percentage point terms. So 75% on average didn't respond, so the non-response rate's going up by 2 to 4%. Okay, based on the risk. And then you can see that the corresponding set are not going down by very much. And the non-compliant firms don't really respond very much to treatment, although a little bit to the UK, oddly enough. And it's the good guys that are dropping out and not responding, right? So it's those that in the control condition, would have been expected to be compliant or refuse service. So that's who's dropping out. For those Magnitsky treatments, before the invasion, there was no meaningful difference between the placebo personas that were innocuous, right, based in Australia and New Zealand, and the treatment that actually were names on actual sanctions lists, right, that existed. After the invasion, we went back and did it again, and we saw the biggest treatment effects we've ever seen in 15 years of doing these studies. But I want to emphasize that, yes, the non-response rate went up, and the rates in the other categories went down, but only by about half. So even at the height of intense screening of Russian clients, there was still lots of access for people whose names were on sanctions lists. So for us, this suggests that the system has lots of holes. I don't think that's news to any of you, but it's nice to quantify it and see exactly where the challenges are. So I've gone over time, but you can get a sense there of what we took away from the study, and I'm certainly happy to talk about this in Q&A and very interested in the other panelists' thoughts as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Gary?
Yes, thank you. Before I jump into the meat of it, I just have to say a couple of things. One is, for those of you that don't follow Dan and his colleagues' research, the first, not this report because it just came out, but his previous work is probably the single most quoted reports and statistics that we used in passing the Corporate Transparency Act, in which he found that the United States was arguably the easiest place in the world to set up and operate an anonymous company. And I have to tell the Florida story just because it's like...
I left it for you.
So when he talks about the response, like the response that he showed you from one of the banks, he got an even better response when they were sending out, would you open an anonymous company to corporate service providers? And there was a response from a provider in Florida who wrote back, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's pretty close. This is clearly dirty money. Could even be terror financing. I won't touch it for less than $5,000 a month. Best response ever. Actual quote. The second thing I want to say is when Victoria was talking about how anonymous companies are used and how we can't identify property, probably the best example that I've ever seen was when the GAO did a study looking at who owned government property. And if you haven't seen this, I swear I'm not making this up. So there was a FBI office in Seattle that housed the anti-money laundering division, right? They couldn't figure out who the owner was. They kept digging. Eventually they found out. Turns out it was owned by a Malaysian family that was being investigated for, you guessed it, money laundering. And finally, you said you were the owner of a dozen companies, total amateur in the Panama Papers. There was a secretary from Panama who was theoretically the beneficial owner of 11,000 companies. So just to give you an idea of how some of this stuff plays out in the real world. What I want to spend a few minutes on, though, is we've talked a lot about the U.S. stepping back from its role in being in pushing for anti-corruption and anti-money laundering measures. And I guess what I want to do is talk a little bit about not only is it tragic in general because we were actually making some progress, but what it means for the global economy and for our efforts in the anti-corruption phase. So starting with what Alex talked about, the shortcomings of the CPI, which I completely agree with, it does tend to focus on corruption in a country. It does not actually talk about the global network and the countries that are the facilitators. And so a few years ago, Transparency International, we put out a supplement to that report called Trouble at the Top, which looked at all the quote-unquote clean countries and said, oh, you all are the facilitators of this. And, when you think about it, it makes sense for a number of reasons. One is, if you're a cop asking for a $20 bribe to get out, somebody get out of a traffic ticket in some country, you just put that in your pocket. When drug cartels were making thousands of dollars when they were still building themselves. They buried it in the backyard. When you're making millions and billions of dollars, you need, as we say, a more sophisticated investment strategy. And as was mentioned, one of the great ironies of this issue is people that steal from non-rule of law countries in particular love to put their money into rule of law countries, right? It is safer investments. Look at how hard it's been for us to go after and get the Russian oligarch money. We can't find it, but when we do find it, there is a process, and there's due process. And there's actually a little bit of a debate in Washington about speeding that up. I'm a little cautious, I have to say, maybe a little bit more conservative than some of my colleagues. I actually do think that the rule of law and due process is a good thing, and I'm not sure we should abdicate due process to show that due process and the rule of law is a good thing. As it is. Our previous Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has said on numerous occasions, following up on Dan and his colleagues' study, that the U.S. is arguably the easiest place in the world to hide and benefit from illicit cash. The U.S. does have, as you know, this de facto reserve currency for the world. That means that more than 50% of transnational transactions happen using the U.S. dollar. And therefore, the rules, the financial rules that we have here and how well we implement them has global resonance in ways that it doesn't, God bless if the EU steps up, but even all of that combined, the US dollar is still going to be, and our financial rules are still going to be, the single most important piece of the pie. And we know that the US had been the most significant player. A few years ago, my organization published a study called Exporting Corruption, where we looked at 47 of the largest exporting countries in the world, those that have the most multinationals that would be working around the world. And it turns out that only 2 countries were actively enforcing their foreign anti-bribery laws. It was the US and Switzerland. Don't ask me why Switzerland, although Rick had a good theory on that. You can talk to him afterwards. The average number of cases that were started in the 2 or 3 year period that we looked at by the rest of the 45 countries just started, not completed, not success, just literally opened an investigation, was 0. So when the U.S. Steps back, it leaves an enormous hole. And so when the Biden administration announced in its national security strategy that corruption was a key component to our national security, it was a big step. It was the first time anybody had ever done that. And in case people are skeptical that, we come out with these strategies and lots of people write memos, it's not perfect, but it does actually have an impact, because it does mean that those people that do want to work on it there's going to be people in the government that are tasked at working on that, and they are going to be allowed to work on that, and it puts resources towards a problem that didn't have it before. So when we dismantle things like the Task Force Kleptocapture or the Kleptocracy Act Asset Recovery Initiative, it does matter. It means resources are actually being put elsewhere. The other thing that was happening in the previous administration that we actually thought, there were a number of things that we thought were actually making progress on this issue after years of the U.S. being the largest culprit in the world. For example, let me just run through a few things. People noted that we passed the Corporate Transparency Act, obviously a big deal. They also closed 2 loopholes that when the Bank Secrecy Act was updated in the Patriot Act back in 2001, 2002, they opened the door for anti-money laundering rules to cover some of the enablers, not all of them, but in particular the real estate sector and the private investment sector. Collectively, you're talking about $80 to $100 trillion of money in those sectors collectively. Immediately after the law was passed and rules were starting to be written in Treasury, both the real estate sector and the private investment sector went and got temporary exemptions. Those temporary exemptions were still in place in 2020. In fact, they were still in place until about 2023. So you had a 20-plus year temporary exemption. And we finally closed those, both of those, with new rules that require certain they're not perfect, but they do require anti-money laundering checks from professionals in the real estate and private investment sector. It was a huge step forward. We also started working with U.S. delegations to the IMF. While the IMF has talked for a number, well, I should say, back in the aughts, the IMF said that governance, corruption, that's not our mission. Literally, that was their policy. It took them until 2018 to pass a resolution through the board, the governing board, saying, you know, corruption and governance can be macro-critical. Doesn't mean it has to be, and there are countries in which it may not be, but it can be. And that was a huge step forward. The staff at the IMF was not necessarily convinced, and so these measures were included in a lot of loan agreements, but they were never enforced. We actually got the US government and the UK government and a few others, investors in the IMF on the board, to go and start enforcing those rules and say you have to start taking those seriously and tell countries they need to start taking it seriously. And the test case we used was Sri Lanka, which was about to go through its 17th loan program in about 20 years. The IMF claims that all 17 loans were successful, but if you look at it closely, what really happened was in order to pay off the IMF loan, they would borrow from the private sector and pay off the IMF loan. I call that a debt trap. They call it a successful loan. Difference in terminology. But we were able to get the board to start understanding, and the IMF recently came out and said they're going to start doing governance diagnostics in a lot more countries. They're going to start evaluating and start including governance reforms in more measures. We are now trying to work with colleagues in Kenya. I see somebody from Kenya here, to see if we can do a similar outcome in a future IMF loan agreement in Kenya that we did with Sri Lanka. It's going to be hard, but there's good coalition. You guys are great there, and so hopefully we can get something done. Similarly, we saw measures in foreign aid. And by the way, I should say that a number of my colleagues in the human rights sector have traditionally been against conditionalities, right, in IMF loans, World Bank loans, foreign aid, because it is a lot of the conditionalities were things like raise taxes and cut social services so you have enough money to pay us back. And it was very harmful to the indigenous populations. And so the IMF, when we first went in there to talk about Sri Lanka, they threw that in our face going, you guys don't have your act together. You disagree amongst yourselves. We went back to Human Rights Watch and Human Rights First and a number, Amnesty, and we said, are you against governance reforms that allows the people to see what's going on in their... They said, no, that's a disgusting distortion of what we meant, and we got a bunch of them to sign letters going, please don't ever say that again, as a pushback that there are good conditionalities and bad conditionalities, and we're looking for good conditionalities that help the country move forward. The next thing I would say is on, in order to make sure that these laws are enforced, which has been a huge problem and discussed in the previous panel, here in the United States we have something called FinCEN, our Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is our financial intelligence unit. This is where all this information from the banks are supposed to go. They're supposed to analyze it and provide risk profiles and help law enforcement move these cases forward. Our financial intelligence unit has less people and actual, and I'm not talking about percentage of GDP, I mean actual dollars and people, fewer dollars and fewer people than our counterpart in Australia, which has an economy 1/15 the size of the US and does not hold the world's reserve currency. There is no way that they can actually help law enforcement do their jobs. We are underfunding our financial cops, and it is actually quite alarming. All right. A couple of other things to quickly go through. I realize I'm running out of time here. So actually, what I will say is this. If looking just a minute on looking forward, obviously we've taken some huge hits in the last few months. Dismantling of the anti-corruption framework, the dismantling of the CTA, the suspension of the FCPA. I think in order to go forward, we need to start rethinking coalitions and who's on our side and who's against us. And part of this, and I will say this in this crowd, I've said this in business gatherings, and while people don't say anything, they also don't necessarily contradict me. A little bit of corruption, not necessarily bad for some multinational corporations. If they can pay a bribe and get what they need to do, then they can control the system and they can control the small and medium enterprises in a given country. But when corruption gets so bad that there is no more honor among thieves, if you will, that even the business community has started calling for anti-corruption measures. The Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is a coalition of governments and businesses coming together, did a study after the city of Guadalajara put its business licensing and permitting online. That's all they did, was put it online. It was an efficiency measure. It was not meant to be an anti-corruption measure. But they did a study and found that requests for bribes went down by 70%. 70%. Even if that study is off by 50%, that's still a huge number. And there were calls from the business community to double down and start digitizing government and looking at anti-corruption measures. On the FCPA suspension, the anti-bribery laws, we've talked to the Chamber of Commerce. They're not happy about it for a whole bunch of reasons I don't have time to go into right now. It creates a whole bunch of uncertainty and increases risk for a lot of companies. On the CTA, we have strong support from law enforcement. They really want this information, and it's something that the administration cares about. Those aren't surprising. What is surprising is on the real estate rule that I mentioned before, the residential real estate rule. The National Association of Realtors actually supports the rule. It's a longer story, I don't have time to go, but I was just on the phone with them, and they're going to go in and tell the administration not to mess with the rule and tell Congress not to overturn the rule. And similarly, the investment advisor rule, because there are a number of brokers and people in the industry that already have those rules, they feel like leveling the playing field, and so it's not T.I. and Gary Kalman against the private investment sector. It's literally the investment sector against the investment sector. And so the largest trade association, which is SIFMA, is actually neutral on the rule, and we think that that can survive. So you wouldn't think that going to the Chamber of Commerce, the Real Estate Trade Association, and the Investment Advisor Trade Association to enforce anti-money laundering rules would be the way to go. But this is a new world. It's unprecedented, and we need to think about it that way. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gary. Brooke, would love to hear from you next.
Okay. Can I have the clicker, please?
Of course.
Could I have my slides? Excellent. Okay, so to perk everyone up this afternoon, I have a pop quiz. Can anyone guess what system links these four problems? Wealth inequality, attacks on democracy, the climate emergency, and the invasion of Ukraine. Bueller? It's offshore finance. All four crises are manifestations of a single phenomenon, which is a global kleptocratic insurgency. Let's meet the kleptocrats. It's a global thing. Up there at the upper left, the former president of Chile, who was impeached for using offshore to violate his own country's environmental laws, investing in a very profitable mine that was going to harm the endangered Humboldt penguin. Right below him is American hedge fund manager Robert Mercer, who was a mild-mannered billionaire until the IRS handed him a tax bill for a couple $100 million, and he went completely off the rails, created an offshore war chest, that's what the Guardian called it, a war chest that funded Cambridge Analytica, the Brexit vote, and the 2016 Trump campaign that we know of, along with a bunch of other stuff. The other folks at the top right there are three heads of state who were found in the Pandora Papers of October 2021 to be accepting bribes and engaging in tax evasion, even though all of them came into office as anti-corruption candidates. You get the picture. So it's a misnomer to think of the offshore financial system as a group of tax havens. It's much more than that. I argue it is a platform for elite insurgency. It sells secrecy to people who have all kinds of unsavory things to hide. Ultimately, the most important thing they want to hide is an extremely unpopular political agenda, which is hostile to democracy and even to capitalism. And they're not anarchists exactly. They style themselves libertarians occasionally, but they're not really libertarians. They want a system in which the state has essentially no power to constrain them or their ability to get wealthier and more powerful, but which retains the power to enforce their contracts and their property rights. Hardly a libertarian agenda. However, they've been very aggressive about promoting a kind of social conflict that has them antagonistic to the concept of public goods and public institutions. This is one of my favorite little factoids. Here's a Stanford class of 1989 graduate, Peter Thiel, publishing 11 years ago in the Wall Street Journal an op-ed called "Competition is for Losers." They don't even like capitalism because they don't always win. They're like little kids who only want to play Monopoly if they get to own Park Place and bankrupt everyone else. So what does the offshore financial system have to do with this? Well, first of all, it's the war chest. It's the financial engine for this political program. I told you about the Brexit campaign, the Trump campaign. Virtually every EU populist party is funded through the offshore financial system. And that's what we know about. That's what's been documented through the offshore leaks. There's probably a lot more we don't know about. It's estimated at the low end by economists like Gabriel Zucman at Berkeley that at least $12 trillion in private household wealth is floating around in the offshore system. That's not corporate wealth. That's a whole other kettle of fish. This is just the private money. It's probably a lot more than that, but Zucman's most conservative estimate is $12 trillion, which is equivalent to 12% of global GDP. That's a lot of money. It costs governments of the world at least $200 billion in taxes. That's a lot of hospitals and roads and schools and other public goods. What does sociology have to add that the economists and political scientists haven't already said? Well, one of the jobs of a sociologist is to try to locate human agency in a system. Like, who makes things happen and how exactly? What are the mechanisms by which that result, that 12% of GDP, how did it get there? Who put it there? My key finding is basically it's the work of a few hundred people. People who thrive in secrecy and discretion. They're called wealth managers. They're a nascent profession that didn't even exist 30 years ago. I mean, people did the job, but it didn't have a name. There were lawyers. It's mostly lawyers, a smattering of bankers, and even some rogue academics who decide to go where the grass is greener financially. But they serve a few thousand billionaires all over the world, and they're helping them. They're instrumental in undermining democracy, because here's the most important thing to know about rich people. They don't do their own shopping, they don't pick up their own dry cleaning, and they don't design their own offshore structures. They have experts for that. Even if they're the smartest billionaire in the world, there is no way that any of them have enough expertise to keep up with the ever-changing myriad of laws that exist offshore. It cannot be done. So they hire these experts. And those people are the hubs of the system, as I'll tell you. Of course. Oh, I'm so sorry. Is this thing on? Oh, yeah, I guess it is. All right. The good news is that represents a huge vulnerability in the system. And what I'm about to tell you about is the 17 years of research I've done on these people, qualitative and now quantitative, that shows that one way to combat this global kleptocratic insurgency and protect democracy around the world is to sanction and otherwise go after these wealth management experts. Because without them, the war chest for the assault on democracy becomes inaccessible to the oligarchs. So how do I know about this? Long ago, starting in 2007, I spent 2 years training to be one of them. I'd already been a professor for about 9 years at Brown University, and I went for what I thought was a 9-month sabbatical to Germany. And long story short, they had a lot of money for high-risk social science research. So I quit my job, sold my house, and said, it's now or never. And I dove into this sort of combination law school MBA program that is recognized around the world. And it trains you to do things like help rich people hide their assets from governments, from divorcing spouses, from debt collectors, from disgruntled heirs, you name it, anyone who wants a piece of their pension or their fortune. So my intention was simply to study the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum, because sociologists claim to study inequality, but mostly sociologists study poor people because they're easy to study. There's a lot of data on poor people. There's virtually no data on the ultra-rich, and that's, of course, by design. One of the things that wealth buys you is privacy and secrecy. So among the few ways that you can understand that world is to join it. And I didn't like my odds for getting the National Science Foundation to like make me rich overnight. I mean, your strategy was pretty innovative, like, you know, opening up some shell corporations and posing as a client or a potential client. That was a thing that, as a qualitative researcher, I didn't think to do. But when I was growing up, PBS was showing the miniseries Upstairs, Downstairs. Anyone remember that? I remember watching that as a little girl and being fascinated by this idea that if you really want to understand rich people, talk to their servants. So it kind of dawned on me one day, I don't need to be among the rich people because they're not the ones protecting their own fortunes. I need to be with their high-end servants. Maybe I can find a way among them. And so training to be a wealth manager put me among them. And I spent, after that initial training period, 15 years chasing those people all over the world to 19 offshore centers and ultimately interviewing 70 of them. That doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about people who face civil and criminal penalties for even accidental disclosures of confidential client information, a lot of people, including me, were thinking at the beginning of this study that my number might be 0, that no one was going to talk to me. What I learned from this is what I'm about to tell you. This is where I went, all the major world regions. What that allowed me to do is get a sense of global variations in the ways the ultra-rich want to hide their wealth and what they want to do with their money. One of the most interesting and unexpected things I heard from their servants was that a lot of these ultra wealthy people, they know each other, they socialize together, they have homes in the same places, they send their children to the same elite private schools, and so that doesn't mean there's a conspiracy afoot. It just means, like, some of you are probably familiar with the work of Michael Useem on corporate board interlocks. So Useem's ideas about how people who serve on the same corporate boards also tend to live in the same places and socialize in the same places, and that gives them opportunities to coordinate ideas. That is happening on a global scale without the necessity of there being a corporate board. It's the use of the offshore financial system, and beneath that, the use of the same very small group of offshore wealth management experts. If any of you follow the gossip rags on Hollywood celebrities, you know, when they need a hairdresser or a nanny, they don't go to Google, they don't go to the Yellow Pages. They ask their friends. It's word of mouth, because there are not many people you can trust. Same thing when it comes to your money, but even more so. So very wealthy people all over the world end up focusing their business on a very small group of wealth managers who are able to serve them and who, most importantly, can be trusted to know where the bodies are buried and keep their mouths shut about it. If you remember the Godfather movies, the consigliere figure, Tom Hagen, we're talking about a few hundred Tom Hagens all over the world. So I want to tell you about 3 ways in which wealth managers fuel the kleptocratic insurgency in the offshore world, and then I'm going to close with what can be done about it. The motto of one offshore financial management company in the UK is actually, I want to be invisible. And that is what they sell to their clients. They sell secrecy. Tax evasion is just a kind of a subset or a manifestation of that secrecy. The goal, the overall strategy of wealth management, what I learned in wealth management school, is almost like how to be a magician. You know, you get up on stage and poof, you make the rabbit disappear in the hat. And then you pull it out again at an opportune moment. That is the essence of wealth management. You make the rabbit disappear there and you make it reappear over there. One of the things that accomplishes is, say that you live in a world that taxes rabbits and you don't want the tax man to know that you have one. So poof, I make the rabbit disappear where it's taxed and I make it reappear where you want to have it. It creates strategic ambiguity. What I learned in wealth management school is how to create strategic ambiguity around who owns what. Because once you do that, you can minimize all kinds of unpleasant things like regulations and exposure of your assets in public records. And the way that that's done, if you were at our lunchtime meeting, I said that the offshore system is built almost the way Legos are built, of very simple building blocks. And the 3 building blocks are corporations, trusts, and foundations. With those 3 basic structures, you can create an almost infinite variety of offshore combinations. So this is straight from one of my wealth management training textbooks. This is a simple structure. It's only 5 layers. If you see on the bottom layer, you have actual assets, a business, a couple of portfolios, a yacht. If you want to hide those things, say you're a Russian oligarch under sanctions and you don't want the EU to grab your yacht, well, you make it very, very expensive and time-consuming for the EU to find out that you actually own the yacht. And you do that by wrapping it in trusts and foundations and perhaps a holding company here or there. And most importantly, you scatter each of those legal containers across multiple countries. And what that does is it increases the transaction costs for anyone who wants to attribute ownership to you. So anyone who wants to say my friend Alex here has a yacht and he becomes a sanctioned academic, if I've helped him wrap his yacht in multiple legal structures, then what will happen is anyone who wants to sanction him is going to have to drill down through maybe 4 layers of legal structures, each of which is in a different country, meaning different legal system, hopefully different languages. It's a pain in the butt. It takes forever. It's very costly. And most governments, frankly, can't afford it. So what the rich do, with the help of their wealth managers, is they play war of attrition. They basically say, okay, come get me if you want, but you're going to spend a decade in court, and it's going to be extremely politically unpopular for you to spend all this taxpayer money coming after little old me. So why don't you go chase some middle-class person instead? And that is essentially what our IRS has done under 20 years of staffing cuts. What you also learn in wealth management school is how to be a kind of political hacker. You exploit the gaps and conflicts among the laws of different countries, because of course our taxation system and the system of national laws was built for a world in which wealth itself was not fungible. It was land. You couldn't just pick it up and move it somewhere else. But as wealth has become more fungible and more mobile, and the people who own it have become more mobile, they have multiple passports, they run around, picking and choosing and shopping among different legal regimes, it becomes very hard within that system to nail down, even if you can attribute ownership of a particular entity to a single person, then what if they just pick up and move? And we saw the Russian oligarchs do this in March 2022. One of the biggest yachts in the world simply turned off its transponder and went off the radar and popped up again like my proverbial rabbit in the UAE, where sanctions did not apply. That was done, I would bet my life savings, with the help of a team of wealth managers. That's the kind of strategy I was taught to create. And so what that means is that for the ultra wealthy, national laws are not constraints at all. They're shopping opportunities. In fact, they send their wealth managers, whenever possible, to handle laundry lists to small countries saying, we want laws like this. You should make laws like this if you want more of our money. Sometimes the wealth managers I spoke to bragged about drafting the laws of various countries to make their clients happier to put their money there. This has come onshore recently. If you followed what's happened in Delaware, where Meta pulled out of Delaware, and then Elon Musk was threatening not to incorporate in Delaware anymore, and the governor of Delaware called an emergency meeting with Elon Musk's lawyers to put their heads together and say, how can we tweak our laws so that you nice rich people don't pick up sticks? That's the kind of thing that's been happening offshore for decades. It's just finally washed up here. Okay, now for the good news. The centrality of these consiglieri, who know where the bodies are buried, is a great vulnerability in the system that we're only beginning to understand and exploit. 2 years ago, I published, with the help of two of my colleagues at Dartmouth, a computer scientist and a network scientist, a study in which we actually tested the idea developed from the previous 15 years of my qualitative research, which is if you were to somehow magically remove wealth managers from the offshore system, you could do away with a lot of the corruption that happens offshore, because the rich people can't do this alone. So we were able to show, using data from the Panama, Paradise, and Pandora papers, that this is in fact demonstrably, empirically, quantitatively the case. So the main findings are that, and this was a big surprise, you know how American airline networks are structured as a hub and spoke, so that if weather hits Chicago or Atlanta, it grounds planes in the whole region, it slows down the whole national network? Well, that's how the offshore system is structured too. And for oligarchs, the more autocratic the country they come from, the more their offshore networks look like airline networks with a hub and spoke system, except the hubs are the wealth managers. And that creates a great fragility in the system. Network scientists call it super fragility. What that means is if you were somehow able legally to take the wealth managers offline, to make it impossible for them to serve sanctioned clients, you could actually do a lot of damage to all the corruption and kleptocracy that happens with the aid of the offshore system. So this also suggests why decades of sanctions against associates of Vladimir Putin and others have not been as successful as expected, because while it's certainly worthwhile to sanction them, they're not the main actors in this system. It's the wealth managers. Remember I said part of the purpose of sociology is to identify who makes things happen and how, to find the agency in the system? Well, let me show you what happens if we look at the offshore networks of sanctioned Russian oligarchs, because a whole bunch of them turned up in the Panama, Paradise, and Pandora papers, and we looked at them. Turns out that of the 26 Russian oligarchs who are in those offshore leaks, they are connected by 124 nodes, which, if you're not a network scientist, means an incredibly small number of connections links all these very important people who make the Russian kleptocracy work. What you see up at the upper left there, that circle with the kind of hubs, that's the hub and spoke system I'm talking about. Those represent countries like the US, China, Hong Kong, and Russia. And in the center of those little purple and blue circles is a little yellow dot. Those represent the wealth managers. Let's zoom in on this a little bit. Turns out that most wealth managers serve a bunch of clients from individual kleptocracies. So kind of like the hairdressers to the Hollywood stars. There are wealth managers for Russian oligarchs, and probably for Kazakh oligarchs, Chinese billionaires. They all have their preferred people, and everybody who's anybody tends to use the same people. That diagram is a little hard to see, but I want you to look at the light blue dots. Those are the wealth managers, and the oligarchs are the yellow dots. So we see the Rotenberg family there, and Andrei Ponomarenko, Kerimov, Modashov. They're all linked through a small group of wealth managers and locations. There's an address there, 33 to 37 Athol Street. That's just a building where all of them are incorporating their offshore structures. Another place in the BVI links 4 sanctioned Russian oligarchs. These aren't just fronts where their shell companies are registered for legal purposes. It's also where the wealth managers are. Like, there are people in those buildings. And it's like the watering holes for jungle animals. You know, if you were to, what I'm talking about is basically saying, if you want to sort of put the tigers out of business, dry up their watering hole. These are the watering holes. So now we can show this with what are called knockout experiments. You don't have to get into the network science of all this, but basically the idea of a knockout experiment is, what if we strategically removed the hubs of some of these offshore networks? In other words, the wealth managers. And what these diagrams show, if you pay attention to the green lines, which represent China, and the blue lines, which represent Russia, it shows that if you take out 1 or 2 of those wealth managers, just pull them offline, so to speak, the whole offshore network of the Russian oligarchs and the Chinese oligarchs collapses, because it's so dependent on these hub people. Why do we care? Well, it suggests a strategy for fighting kleptocracy. One thing you can do is sanction wealth managers. Don't cut off their ability to practice their profession. No, they can still work for people who aren't sanctioned, but you can ban the experts from working with sanctioned clients. This is a very old strategy. It was actually implemented quite successfully in 2022 by the EU, the UK, and the US. And it has a legal basis that goes back at least 60 years to limits on the transfer of expertise during the Cold War. If you happen to be, say, a nuclear scientist or a chemical weapons expert, you could be sanctioned for working with certain forbidden parties. You could still do your job, just not with certain people. That model also works offshore to fight kleptocracy. So as we go forward, what I'm working on now with my colleagues in computer science and network science at Dartmouth, with a 2024 NSF grant that, please God, won't be canceled by DOGE, we're taking this analysis of Russian and Chinese oligarchs global, and we're trying to sort of backwards analyze how certain network structures can be taken as sort of heat signatures of economic corruption and democratic decline. And there's more here in my 2 recent books.
Thank you, Brooke. I feel so at home with these senses of undercover reporting in the panelists today. I feel like I'm having a conversation with a journalist in my newsroom. We'll turn it over to Mark, who will be our discussant and give us a little bit of weaving through all of these conversations.
And I will put an end to your feeling of sitting and having conversations in your living room with people you have commonality with, because I am a bit of an outlier, I think, on this panel in ways that I hope are productive, but that I wanted to talk about a little bit first as a way of framing my reaction to all of these very interesting papers. And I guess it might help if I start with the thought that has crystallized in my mind listening to these panelists, excuse me, which is that my takeaway is that we can have the best system of laws and regulations that we can imagine, there's still going to be significant amounts of illicit capital flows. And so the need for some kind of ex post tool to uncover and ideally recover those. And that area overlaps most heavily with my own interests, and so I want to talk about it a little bit and maybe in the process raise some tensions, I guess, that I see in the discussion today. So I study 2 things, really. I study arbitration, which is, I'm sure as most or all of you know, a private dispute resolution system favored by many people precisely for its opacity. And I study sovereign debt, which has some parallels to the topic today that have become clearer to me as I've listened to folks talk. And so I want to identify a couple of those parallels. And a lack of transparency is chief among them. So it is quite routine in the context of a debt restructuring to realize that the government has almost no idea who it has borrowed from or how much it has borrowed, a problem that gets worse as the country's economy sinks into more and more dire straits and the country resorts to more and more unusual borrowing and idiosyncratic borrowing forms. And often in many of these cases, there are political elites who have used the country's borrowing capacity essentially to line their own pockets. And of course, they've then stashed those funds in the offshore financial system. And so the topic of transparency has been a very, very big deal. And it's become also quite clear how hard it is to coordinate across jurisdiction on transparency rules. So, for instance, some of the most salient policy actors are governments that are big lenders. China draws a lot of attention in this context and have very different norms about what counts as about the value of transparency in this context. So most Chinese lending is subject to non-disclosure agreements and so forth. So the second parallel the sovereign debt world seems to have, to my mind, is that one doesn't have to look too hard to see how deeply indifferent market intermediaries are to problematic and even outright sanctionable types of behavior. I have numerous examples of that. One of my favorites has to do with the changes to Russian sovereign bond contracts after the annexation of Crimea. As the risk of sanctions increased, the country basically agreed with its investors that if, due to sanctions, it lost access to the dollar and euro payment systems, it could avoid those sanctions by paying them in rubles. Hasn't quite worked out that way, but the contracts were designed to allow it to happen. So as far as I know, those contract provisions were designed without batting an eye by the normal mainstream lawyers and financial intermediaries you would expect, and they weren't priced by investors. They were a matter of basic indifference. And so the question of how one makes salient to market participants the rules and norms that govern their conduct is quite an important one, and I think Dan's research actually, there are some parallels there to some of Dan's findings. So with that kind of prefatory background, let me just lob a couple of questions in the direction of panelists that will hopefully tie the discussion that we've had here today to my broader set of concerns, and I think to the set of concerns that a lot of lawyers will have who are focused less on ex-ante regulation of market intermediaries. Excuse me. And more as I am on ex post asset discovery methods. And the key point I want to make is that private actors are going to play a significant role in any attempt to uncover and recover siphoned off assets. And private actors have actually gotten pretty good at untangling the really complicated corporate structures that Brooke has talked about. They're not great at it, they're pretty good, and they're getting better. And the private actors who are good at it are deeply invested in the system of maintaining opacity. They're basically hedge funds. So the way I think about this, the two most significant developments in the civil justice system over the last 50 years or so are the networking of plaintiffs' firms into consortia that can tap deep pools of capital and manage risk, And then the arrival of litigation finance vehicles with massive amounts of money to direct solely to backing litigation. And it leads to some delicious ironies, right? In the sovereign debt world, we get to see corrupt politicians who've siphoned off a great deal of the national wealth chased around the world by Cayman Island investment vehicles with anodyne names that exist to obscure the fact that major university endowments are actually behind the litigation. And that's sort of fun, but it's also telling about who has the capital and the expertise and the knowledge needed to break these structures. And it is, for lack of a better word, participants in the offshore financial system. And so I think one of the areas that we have to struggle with as lawyers, and one of the deeper conversations that I think is prompted by this discussion today, is how one goes about harnessing private litigants. And I think one has to harness private litigants as in a sense, regulatory adjuncts here when they are deeply, deeply conflicted and in no way going to share sort of in any kind of two-fisted way the government's own objective. I respect the role that nonprofits can play, but I think that role is shrinking and probably going to shrink further given current legal developments. And so one sort of important area of further inquiry to me that emerges from this is just the question of what private enforcement looks like in this context. A second question I want to raise, more as an observation, I guess, than a question, is the observation that opacity is sometimes quite good. And by good, I don't just mean it offers benefits to the people who are buying it. I mean it sometimes generates public goods itself. Mm-hmm. And so let me give you an example from my corner of the world. There may be others that folks here can think about, but the world of sovereign debt is a system of incomplete laws and incomplete institutions. And so there are sort of second best or third best solutions to every problem. Basically, when a country needs to restructure its debt, the mechanics don't matter, but there is some rough agreement reached that allocates the cost of adjustment between the country and its creditors. And then there is a subset of creditors who would like to defect from that agreement, and no easy way to prevent them from defecting. And if they're successful, one way to understand that is it just shifts an inappropriate amount of the costs of adjustment onto the country's population. It's sort of a classic problem, well understood. It has a solution, though. The solution is the exact opacity that we are talking about today, especially for capital exporting countries. The complex transaction structures that we're looking at are standard liability management. They allow you to export without having the commodities that you're exporting and the receivables they generate seized by your creditors. And so it is a little bit hard, and I feel somewhat, in part as a lawyer, conflicted in thinking about opacity, even in this context, as something that is purely bad. And so the question of how one would design regulations that bring additional transparency into the system without costing us those public goods is itself an interesting question. And I have a few more minutes, but we only have 15 roughly for the panel. Is that right? Left?
Yes.
So let me just call it so that we have time for folks on the floor to ask questions.
Well, thanks. Thank you so much. I think I'm actually going to pick up off that last point that Mark just made. And Gary, I think I might punt this to you because I'm curious in you illuminating a little bit more. There was a lot of conversation around transparency. Is it the panacea? Is it not? And you gave that terrific example of how just a few little transparency requirements all of a sudden brought down by 70%, I think you said, some kinds of corruption. other points about transparency often with regards to public records laws. For example, the information is often minimal that can be given through transparency regulation. Often it's old information, difficult to obtain. So often it takes a long time to get that kind of information unless you are, a reporter getting something from a leak and putting it up there. Brooke, I liked the idea that you said often these wealth managers the whole point is that they're keeping this list of individuals private and hidden. It makes me wonder, should we just, put out a global list of the ultra wealthy, everyone over 30 million, you get to be put on a list. But there are drawbacks, obviously, to transparency. And so, Gary, I'm curious in hearing from you, given your role, what are the thoughts you have around transparency? Where should it be targeted? And how have you thought about it? Why was the CTA one, thing you guys were focused on? What other aspects of transparency are there for us to grab out there?
Sure, lots in that question.
Yeah.
I guess a couple of things, just as you were saying, take a step back, just to answer your question directly. The reason we focused on the Corporate Transparency Act is that through multiple studies over the last 30 or 40 years, it really it became clear that anonymous vehicles, whether they be trusts or companies or what have you, that was the brick wall that prevented us from actually making progress on it, right? I sometimes describe the Corporate Transparency Act or beneficial ownership transparency as the foundational, it's the foundational reform. Think about like building a house. If you build a house and you don't build a foundation, it's going to fall down. But if you only build the foundation, you can't live in it. So Corporate Transparency Act and beneficial ownership is a foundation that we need to build. There's going to be other things we need to do. The thing about, oh my gosh, there's all these, it's complicated and there's all these complex structures or whatever. FinCEN, when it was doing, in the previous administration, putting out its guidelines for implementing the Corporate Transparency Act, said those that create complex structures do so knowing that there could be additional regulatory responsibility. It turns out that about 80% of all the 32 million businesses in the United States are non-employer firms. There's one person, right? They don't have corporate, it's pretty clear who owns them. In fact, many of them we know. It's not really that difficult to figure out who owns Joe's Pizza, right? It's Joe. And so if you are going to create the corporate structure, right, the burden and cost figure that we keep getting thrown in our faces seems to me a red herring in that it is, I believe, impossible to have the resources to pay the lawyers who are going to create the structure, but then not have the resources to pay those same lawyers to say who's at the top of the food chain. This is just, it's not possible. And so I do think that just in terms of implementation and practicality, this is not that difficult to do. It, of course, like I said, and my colleagues have said, there's lots of different ways in which they are manipulating the system. But I do think that it is doable. We've seen some of this stuff have real success. Let me stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Dan, I wanted to turn to you and ask, I think one of, the pieces of information we took from your study was where things failed, right? And banks were a big part of the process. But I'm curious, what were the successes of regulation? Where did you see the silver linings? Not necessarily for those institutions, but in the structures that you were observing. Where did you see the successes?
I mean, that's a good question. There's a real range of compliance with Financial Action Task Force standards. And some countries have very few violations, right? I mean, we've audited them, dozens of times, and they always demand ID of the beneficial owner, right? And ironically, those are predominantly tax havens. Offshore jurisdictions, usually small island countries. Why are they so good? Because the Financial Action Task Force was designed to stop them from money laundering. And so the United Kingdom and the United States and their allies put all kinds of pressure on these small island states to conform and comply with FATF standards, and they do. So clearly it can be done. Now, the problem is that the UK and the US do not apply those standards to their own systems, right? That's the problem. So, countries like Switzerland, kind of semi-compliant. Again, they have resources, so they're not, they're not facing the same kinds of power imbalances that the small island countries do. So, and when I talk to the regulators, right, at these conferences, where I go to give my presentation, that the regulators know all the firms. And they joked about each other, you're coming to audit me this week, and it's not that costly to have random audits of incorporation services and banks, to check to see if their regulated entities are in compliance. Some governments are getting in on the act. Some banking regulators, have started doing the secret shopping kind of exercise like we did to learn, where the, vulnerabilities are in their systems. So I hope that more of that goes on, and when it does, I think we're going to see a different kind of compliance.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I feel like you and Brooke have both hit that, like, a lot of this is about relationships, really. It makes me wonder, outside of the legal system, what are the extra legal solutions that actually exist? And maybe that's where, you start tapping into things like reputation and conversations, rather than actually a regulatory structure that you've shown often has many, many holes. Brooke, I want to turn to you. I thought that was fascinating what you described, these hub and spokes, and you've identified a major hub. And I think I'm going to push you a little bit outside of just the wealth managers. What are other hubs that you've seen interacting with, these wealth managers? Do you think that just focusing on them, obviously, is there another way to look at it other than just wealth managers, particularly given that they're looking at just the private realm? Where do they overlap with corporate structures and corporate wealth? And just curious in you illuminating a little bit more on that hub and spoke and why wealth managers are the only thing, or is there something more bigger to look at in that structure, not just the LLCs or the banks? Can you orient me a little bit in why that's the focus and where else to look?
Sure. I'd also like to say one thing. Remember how Dan was talking about how his work was subject to IRB, human subjects considerations, and like deception is not allowed? Well, that applies to me as a sociologist too. So I didn't go undercover. At all times through all 17 years of this study, I've had to tell people, what my real name was, what my real institutional affiliation was, and what my research purpose was. So if I had tried to do otherwise by deceiving anyone and going undercover, I wouldn't have been able to get grants or publish anything. So in the corporate world, there are different set of entities that serve the same sort of purpose for firms that wealth managers do for private individuals. And there is a certain amount of overlap. I'm not sure anyone knows how much overlap there is. But it's like these two parallel ecosystems that don't exactly compete with each other. They're more symbiotic. It's the PwCs of the world. And the big four accounting firms are probably the hubs of the corporate offshore game, so to speak. And they have armies of attorneys who basically innovate, almost like a research and development shop, new ways of avoiding regulations and avoiding taxation. And my understanding is that this is not my area of expertise, but I read the work of people who are experts in it. Their game is also to create certain strategic ambiguities. So for example, if you own a major multi-billion-dollar company and you're based in a country that is developing new regulations that you don't want to abide by, you could hire PwC and its R&D arm to come up with an innovative strategy for, and this is the wonderful term of Doreen McBarnett, who is a law professor at the University of Oxford. She called it creative compliance. So the attorneys for PwC and so forth, they specialize in helping their clients abide by the letter of the law while violating the spirit of the law. And so, you buy a strategy from a PwC or similar corporation, and they will, for an additional sum, write you a kind of insurance policy. I believe it's called a letter of advice that says, we have advised our clients, the Victoria Baranetsky Corporation, that this tax strategy or this regulatory strategy is legal, and we attribute like 70% probability to this being okay. But if for some reason you decide that it's illegal, our bad, come after us, not Victoria Baranetsky Corporation. So that's, if I were going after corporations' use of the offshore financial system, I would target the big four accounting firms.
So interesting. I like how you've identified essentially like people who are just supposed to be mavericks in the back pocket of wealth and help hide things essentially. I think I'll take a moment and also just say that journalists do not do undercover reporting illegally either. They also have to abide by the rules, and usually that's developing relationships with sources and getting that information, or also disclosing their information, getting towards the truth with regards to their reporting, which more and more we've seen has ended in an LLC somewhere hiding something, or government giving their information to contractors. I'll just turn to the audience because I think that there are other folks that probably want to ask questions. 3 minutes. Right. In the back?
It all kind of boils down to where would the agency for trying to crack down on this come from? And where would that effort emanate from? I mean, it's easy how you can gather a coalition against fighting illicit drugs or fighting something that is a huge scar on any society, but something that is floating around in a universe where people do not see it, where it's kind of stealthy. How would one put together a coalition based on all the principles we've been talking about? That seems to me the challenge. So when you have an invasion of Ukraine, that produces a kind of stimulus to go after the oligarchs and so forth. But barring extraordinary events like that, I think the pressure and the incentive to have a constant effort kind of evaporates. So how you keep that coalition of the willing very strong and make states go after it, especially when you see like Marie Le Pen was, for example, her campaign was financed to a large degree by many of these companies and of these structures we're talking about. Many politicians in Europe are also financed by. Many of the populist right are financed by such structures. So I think that's the big challenge.
Gary, I think that question might be well directed towards you. You were talking about coalition building being so important. Can you speak a little bit as to how you build those coalitions, where you think there might be coalitions that exist in this kind of environment?
Yeah, I mean, the main point I was trying to make earlier was I think we need to rethink how we think about this, right? And who's a friend and who's a foe. And also, I think that this issue, because of conferences like this and colleagues like this on the panel and out in the audience here, that this issue, there's a different thinking about secret finance and corruption in the way in which, right? So, and let me just run through a couple of quick things. One, as I said before, the human rights groups were against conditionalities to improve anti-corruption measures because they were generally blanketly against conditionalities. But when confronted with, well, wait a minute, there's good and bad, all of a sudden they're now joining. That is the first time that that's ever happened. Second thing I would say is, I'll give you another example. The Gates Foundation used to be against this because they didn't want to talk about corruption because they were trying to work with governments to get education and healthcare projects done. And so if you called the government corrupt, you couldn't work with them. They're now beginning to realize that so much of their money is being lost or stolen or diverted that they are now rethinking their approach. Well, they still don't want to use the word corruption, right? I talked about the business community. The banks, for example, you talked about FATF. The banks are now concerned that FATF might actually put the US on a gray list, which would make transnational transactions slower because the US would now suddenly be a jurisdiction of concern. So they want to make sure that we're not FATF incompliant, and so want some of these rules to go in. So there's just a different math that's happening that I think we need to take advantage of and try and bring players together that normally have not been in this space.
Thank you. I think we're going to let Brooke have one final word, and then we'll close out the panel.
Very quickly, you're right. There's a huge problem of building legitimacy for a transnational movement to shut down abuses of the offshore system. There are enduring organizations that have been fighting this battle through the means of multinational coalition for 25 years or more. The OECD is one of those organizations. The problem is, from a game theoretic perspective, the incentives to defect are enormous. And that's part of why the US has become the best place to hide money in the world. So when the OECD comes out with initiatives like the Common Reporting Standard, which is specifically designed to stop the abuses of the offshore system by the kind of people I study, the US declined to sign on to that. They said, oh, we already have FATCA, which is complete garbage because that only refers to American citizens, only applies to American citizens. The US makes tons of money off of being the defector in the OECD's Common Reporting Standard global framework. And until that calculus can be altered in some way, for example, by a legitimacy crisis, which is what the Russian invasion of Ukraine just provoked, it's hard to sort of move these actors who are, kind of slobbering over all the money they're going to make by being defectors to international coalitions.
Well, thank you. That was a terrific way to end the panel, and we'll all talk later.